I just love it. I love baptizing people and help them go public in their faith with Jesus. It was awesome to have our first baptism service here in this church while I've been here. And it was so cool for me because there's such a spectrum there. Yeah, that's good. Such a spectrum. We had, young ladies who grew up in this church, and they've been here forever, since they can remember. We have some who've been here a couple years and we're finally ready to take that step. And we have some who are just new and plugged in. And what an indication of how God has been at work through this church. He is at work through this church, and He's going to continue to be at work through this church. And I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude to God. I'm also glad you can be here because now we're in the thick of our Mission Possible series, where we're walking through the story of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And for some of you, that's like, really? The Old Testament? You haven't spent a whole lot of time in the Old Testament. But hopefully this series is just opening your eyes so that, there is some powerful stuff in here. The Old Testament is packed. And my prayer is that it whets your appetite to get in for yourself. And the reason why we're looking at Nehemiah's story is because really, there's no better example of anyone in Scripture when it comes to both discovering and then accomplishing your God-given mission in life. Everyone here has a God-given mission in life. And so our approach then isn't to come up with our own plan and our own dreams and our own agenda and approach God and ask Him to bless it. The way we should go about this is we bring Him the blank sheet of paper and say, okay, God, You've had plans for me since before I was born. You just let me know what they are, and I'm in. God, tell me what my part is in Your story, and I'll play it. And we see that in the life of Nehemiah, this incredible story of how God works through Nehemiah to accomplish something that otherwise would have been impossible. Because there were others who tried to do what Nehemiah did, and they failed in the effort. Now, what was Nehemiah's God-given mission? It was rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And this was 444 BC in that neighborhood, back in the day when a city was only as safe and secure as its walls were strong. And unfortunately, the walls and the temple of Jerusalem had been leveled to the ground about 140 years before because the people of God had been unfaithful to Him. He'd give them multiple second chances. He'd give them repeated warnings, but they kept drifting further and further and further from God until He finally said, okay, I'm removing my protection. And He allowed an invading army to come in and lay waste to the city of Jerusalem. And then thousands of Jews were taken into captivity and forced to live hundreds of miles away in exile. Enter Nehemiah. He's a descendant of one of those Jews who was living in exile. He lived in the capital city of Susa, which was the capital city for the Persian Empire, the empire that controlled the entire Middle East at that time. Now, the really awesome thing is that I love about this story is we see God working through Nehemiah big time, but Nehemiah wasn't a priest. And I love it because so often I bump into other followers of Christ who carry this idea with them that, as far as being called, that's pastors, that's preachers, that's missionaries. But for the rest of us, we just kind of go about our daily business, show up for church every once in a while and throw something in the plate and we're good. Now remember, each and every one of us has a calling from God. Pastors aren't just here to be the called ones. No, actually what our role is to help you discover your calling and then equip you to go live it out. So I love how that just shines forth in Nehemiah's story. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't even of noble birth, but God had him in a key situation. What his job was, he was the cupbearer to the king, one of the highest ranking, most trusted positions in the entire court of Persia. He was responsible for making sure the emperor wasn't poisoned through his food. And as we saw, God did a miracle in the king's heart. He brought about a shift because before Nehemiah, the king had been opposed to the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem. But we saw that shift occur so that not only did he release Nehemiah with his blessing, go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, come back when you're done. No, he even supported Nehemiah materially, politically, even gave him a bodyguard. Then, over the last 2 weeks, we saw how Nehemiah finally arrived in Jerusalem for the first time in his life. He made the 800-mile journey. He got there. He took stock of the situation. And then he called the people together, and he called them to this work of rebuilding the wall. And their response was incredible. Their response was, let us rise. Let us rebuild. And so we got to see how it moved from a me mission to a we mission. which ultimately all of our God-given missions involve other people. God doesn't want us to go about these things in isolation. So, people on board now. They started building. Easy peasy, right? Oh no. Oh no. The challenges really have just started, which is important to note because I've seen people have to wait and struggle in order up until that door gets opened to follow their God-given mission, and then they think it's smooth sailing after that. And I want to say, no, there is a whole new host of challenges waiting for you once you're immersed in your God-given challenge. That's when the real work begins. And as we're going to see, not everyone was as excited about Nehemiah's God-given mission. Not everyone was on board with this. In fact, some were outright opposed to it and were willing to do almost anything to stop this. Now, if we step back and we just look at the big picture, that shouldn't surprise us, because this is a God-given mission. And so that means Nehemiah's mission here falls under the umbrella of God's overall effort to reach the world. And so this lands in the context then of a cosmic battle that's going on in our world, a spiritual battle between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the devil. God is working to reach as many as he can who will freely choose to follow him, and the devil is at work to disrupt that. So wherever you see someone pursuing a God-given mission, at some point, it's going to be opposed. That's why even Jesus in the gospel is opposed at almost every turn by the Pharisees. It's why Moses, as he's leading the Israelites to the promised land, he's opposed by the Jebusites and the Perizzites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Amalekites and all the ites of the Canaanite tribes. It's why David was opposed by the Philistines. It's why Luke had to face Darth Vader. Just seeing if you're paying attention. It's why Matt Ryan has to go through Tom Brady for the Super Bowl. Ooh. Just lost all the Patriot fans. But it's true. So don't be surprised. Don't be surprised, some doorways open. Yes, I get to follow my God-given mission. That you don't very soon run into some opposition. Nehemiah did. And we don't have to guess at who his opposition was, because he gives us their names, and he goes into vivid detail about what they did to try to stop this project. So, who were the ones who were opposed to Nehemiah's God-given mission? Well, the first one was Sanballat the Horonite. By the way, you should be turning to Nehemiah chapter 4. That's where we're really going to take off today. Nehemiah chapter 4, about maybe a third of the way into your Bibles. Sanballat the Horonite. He really seems to be the leader of the pack of those who are opposing Nehemiah. His name is a Babylonian name meaning sin, which that should tell you something, I guess, though there was a Babylonian moon goddess named Sin. He was a Horonite, which that's actually kind of significant. That locates him in a metropolitan area 11 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Now, the significance of that is that that was the city that guarded the major trade route into Jerusalem. So with Sanballat being governor there and that guarding the trade route, it meant that he exercised incredible economic influence over Jerusalem. Beyond that, he was a Samaritan. And if you spend any length of time in scriptures, you're going to read about how there was such a high level of hostility between Jews and Samaritans. And there's a history of conflict, and that had already been going on for a few centuries by this point. And so no wonder Sanballat's the ringleader of the opposition. Second, we meet Tobiah the Ammonite. Now, he probably claimed to follow the same God that Nehemiah did. His name actually means the Lord is good. But he wasn't just a wolf. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing because of that. In fact, history tells us that he had some pretty strong connections in the city of Jerusalem. He had married one of the daughters of Meshullam, who was one of the key leaders of the rebuilding project in chapter 3 that we looked at last week. Also, it was evident he had a friendship with Eliashib, the high priest, right? The high priest who got the other priests out, and they rebuilt and dedicated the sheep gate. This is kind of strange. So he had these friendships with leaders in Jerusalem, but make no mistake, he was not a friend of Nehemiah, and he was not a friend of Jerusalem. And then finally we have Geshem the Arab. And he was seemingly in charge of this confederacy of Arab tribes stretching from Egypt up into southern Judea, including the area around Jerusalem. So these three were the main ones. They were in cahoots together. They were friends. They were business associates. And they had become quite rich and powerful by taking advantage of Jerusalem. Now, why would they care if there's a wall around Jerusalem or not? Why would they be opposed to this project? Well, sure, they hadn't wiped Jerusalem out yet, which they could have because Jerusalem was kind of defenseless. But what their policy had been was let's keep her nose above water just enough to keep Jerusalem alive so we can continue to profit from her. But we're not going to let her up any further than that. Now Nehemiah arrives on the scene. Who's this guy? Well, he was the cupbearer for the king. He's got this position in the court. He's got the backing of the king. Here's someone, all right, with enough horsepower to break up their racket. Someone who's strong enough to curb or end their influence there in Jerusalem. And so I'm sure they felt quite threatened by Nehemiah's presence there. Now just think about your own life. Maybe you have experienced this. Maybe you've experienced someone being opposed to you. And for the life of you, you can't think about, what did I ever do to them? Well, the truth is you probably didn't. But the reason they're against you is that they're threatened by you. And in those cases, it almost doesn't matter how nice you try to be to them. In fact, sometimes even being nice to them only fuels the anger and that resentment. And you're in this situation, this doesn't make sense. Well, that's what's going on. Nehemiah hadn't done anything to offend them, but his presence there threatened him, so they were opposed to it. So not only did Nehemiah then have the challenge of this rebuilding project, he had to learn how to dance with these wolves who were out to get him in the midst of this huge reconstruction project. And in the passages that we're going to look at today, we're going to see that they attack him in two different ways. There was two levels of opposition. One level was mocking and ridicule, but then they step it up with outright threats. Now let's take a look at that first level. And we have to back up just a little bit to Nehemiah chapter 2. It's where we get the first glimpse of this. This is where Nehemiah's just had his breakthrough moment, and the king has just signed off and said, I'm going to support you. Go get that wall rebuilt. Verse 19, but when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab, all right, so there they all listed together, the wolves, and it's funny how wolves form packs, isn't it? But when they heard about it, look at this, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? And that last question, that's a touchy one. Okay, so remember I said that many had tried before Nehemiah to get the wall rebuilt, but they had failed. Well, that's true. History shows there were multiple efforts to get those walls rebuilt, but when it would happen, the other leaders in the region would be threatened by it, and they would petition to the king of Persia to put the kibosh on the project. And what was it that would convince the king of Persia that he should put the kibosh on the project? Well, they would list out Jerusalem's history of rebellion. And so for them to throw this question out there, right, are you rebelling against the king? For weak leaders, that alone might cause them to back off and go, oh, hey, no, I don't want to get that rumor started. I don't want to get in trouble with the king. Now, Nehemiah had reason to be confident in his relationship with the king, all right? He and the king, remember, they were tight. They had this daily relationship where the king trusted Nehemiah with his life. But that's not where Nehemiah's confidence ultimately came from. Look at this, verse 20. This is Nehemiah speaking. He said, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So instead of backing down at some of this mocking and ridicule, Nehemiah clings to his God and he pushes back at him. Right? And no doubt his response stirred their pot. I'm sure they were chafed by this. What? That's pretty cheeky for Nehemiah to show up. Remember, he just arrived in town a few days ago after never having been there. And now he's telling Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, guys who had exercised influence over Jerusalem a long time. I mean, remember, they knew the nobles in Jerusalem. Tobiah had this friendship with the high priest. They probably all had apartments at least in Jerusalem. And now Nehemiah is saying, you have no place here. And that bit about you have no historic right or claim here, that would have especially rub Sanballat a little raw because the Samaritan, and it plays into that centuries-old debate that they had. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, which we looked at last week, then we get the construction journal entry of how the wall was rebuilt, and it was cool. If you missed it, you should go back and listen to last week. Then we get to chapter 4, and if Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem had hoped that a little mocking and a little ridicule would put the brakes on that project, they were sorely disappointed. So we see this in verse 1. When Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. So maybe a little bit didn't do the trick, so maybe a lot of ridicule will do it. And in the presence of his associates and now look at this, and the army of Samaria. At this point, Samaria had a standing army. Jerusalem didn't. That gives the Samaritans quite an advantage in any conflict that they might have. All right, so Sanballat's here, and he's in the presence of his army, and he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer their sacrifices? Will they finish in a day?" And you know, mockers, they do that. They exaggerate, right? They spin things. Nehemiah had never said it was going to be done in a day, and yet they're using this as a barb against him. Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Now, this is interesting because many of the stones that were used to build the wall in Jerusalem originally were limestone. That's one of the stones of that area. Unfortunately, when limestone gets burned or scorched, it becomes brittle and it loses its structural strength, meaning you can't reuse them. So not only do you have to haul then the rubble away, then you have to quarry out new stones. Incredibly, incredibly hard work. So here's Sanballat. He's out with his associates. He's out in front of his army making fun of the Jews, and he's thorough in his criticism because he hits them on all fronts, right? He criticized the character of the builders, questioned their ability, questioned their commitment to see this through and finish it. He kind of just questioned the overall feasibility of the whole thing. And then the picture is kind of his army's just laughing, you know? What are these Jews doing? They think they can do this? Build it in a day. No, those Jews, they can't do it. They're probably puffing out their chests a little bit. We should go down there and show those Jews something. Well, it's not over. But now they know that they have opposition to the north, Jerusalem. Well, now Tobiah, he gets involved. He decides to pour it on too. Verse 3. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, and so again, that shows how Sanballat was really kind of the leader here. Sanballat was the big guy, and Tobiah, he was Grover Dill, basically. You remember him from A Christmas Story? All right, Sanballat's Scott Farkas, all right, the big tall bully, right? But then next to him is Grover Dill. And that's what Tobiah is. He's the little toady, right? So he hears Sanballat pour it in. Well, he's got to jump in too. He said, "Yeah, you know, what are they building? Even a fox climbing on it would break down their wall of stones." You know? So everybody's yucking it up. And these guys hope to either discourage the Jews, or maybe they can get the Jewish people living there to turn against Nehemiah. Remember, these people all had known these guys for a long time, and they'd been in control there. Nehemiah had only been there for a few days, so maybe they can get the Jews to go, "No, Nehemiah, no, don't get us in trouble with these guys, all right? They can make things bad for us." Well, was Nehemiah intimidated? Look at verse 4. "Hear us, our God, for we're despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they've thrown insults in the face of the builders." Whew. So no, he pushes back. There's no way he's backing down. He presses into God even harder. And I imagine him getting the reports of Sanballat and Tobiah and what they said. I imagine him getting the reports from a messenger as he's walking about the wall inspecting things. And I wonder if he even stopped when he heard it, or if he just threw this prayer up to God while he's on to the next thing. Because it kind of has the feel of one of those along-the-way prayers. But first note, how does Nehemiah respond to ridicule and mockery? Well, he does it with prayer, and he keeps plugging. Prayer, and he keeps plugging. Now you might think, well, yeah, but that prayer isn't very nice. And that's not how they taught me to pray in Sunday school. Okay, he might need a Snickers, but still, it is totally in line with the good psalmists. And he lays it all out there for God. God, turn these insults back on their heads. Lord, make them eat their words. Give them a double portion because they're insulting your builders. They're opposed to your work. Does he start running? No. Does he panic and start, oh, what do we do? Oh, we better stop. No. Does he start plotting revenge? No, he doesn't do that either. He just commits the matter to God in prayer, and he keeps plugging. That's not easy, because none of us like to be mocked, do we? And whenever someone insults or throws a few jabs at us, instinctively, we tend to want to respond to that, or we want to think about what we need to do in order to get them to stop. But the moment we do that, we're no longer thinking about how to go about our God-given mission, and now we're letting the wolves lead in the dance. And Nehemiah doesn't fall for that. He trusts God with the matter. He keeps plugging. Probably even picked it up a notch. Look at verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. So the Jews keep chugging. So now look at how the wolves respond. Verse 7. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod, so now there's more people piling on, heard that the repairs to Jerusalem walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So now the wolves are forming a pack and they're going to come take out the Jews. Okay, so now, if you're keeping track, we have Sanballat to the north. He's out to get them. We have Tobiah, who's to the east, and he's out to get them. We have Geshem, who's to the south. He's out to get them. It's just ocean to the west. So they're really in a pickle. So it's no longer just sticks and stones. They've moved beyond that. There's a real danger here. Remember, Jerusalem didn't have a standing army, and at least Samaria did. Now, the emperor gave Nehemiah an armed escort, right? But a bodyguard isn't an army. And sure, the Nehemiah had the king's backing. But this is 800 miles away. And these three wolves, they're used to being in power. And they probably have a good position with the emperor too. So they might decide, I think we're going to ask for forgiveness on this one instead of permission. Could happen. Nehemiah's response. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. I love it. First Nehemiah prayed, then he posted a guard. No whining, no complaining. I look at this, I'm like, yes. Nehemiah shows some spiritual guts here. He shows some tenacity, which I just love. We have this incredible mix of both faith and action. He prayed, he posted a guard. Ultimately, his trust was fixed in God. There's no doubt about that. And yet he did all he could do to respond to the threat without, don't miss this, without losing sight of the mission or giving up on the mission God had given him. Issue didn't go right away, though, and then other challenges come to the surface. Look at this, verse 10. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. So now Nehemiah, he's not only having to deal with the wolves who are opposed to it, but now his builders are literally hitting the wall. They've reached that dangerous stretch where they're out past their initial enthusiasm, and yet there's a long way to go still to the finish line. When I look at where they're at, it kind of reminds me of where I was several years back when some buddies and I decided we were going to climb Cloud Peak in the Bighorns in Wyoming. And it's kind of a long hike. And there's this point you get where in the middle of it, you can no longer see where you started. So you can't be encouraged by seeing how far you've come. And then you can no longer see the summit, so you can't see how far you have yet to go. And I'll just tell you, in those moments, your mind starts playing tricks with you. Oh, man, I don't know if you can do it. It's probably going to take forever, and your feet start dragging. The builders of Jerusalem were at that point. Their strength was giving out. Now, we should cut them some slack because they are rebuilding a rock wall. That is hard labor that evidently they weren't used to. And they still had their day jobs that they had to be going about. And so they are wearing out. And then remember, so much of the rubble they couldn't even use to build the wall, so they had to go get new rocks, and they are just discouraged. I think working around rubble, that is a challenge. I even saw that on a little scale just a few weeks back when we were in Haiti, and we're rebuilding this church that was destroyed from the Hurricane Matthew. And it seems like every place we had to put a post, there is a pile of busted up concrete. So you have to get that out of the way, right? And then you dig your hole, and you want to save some dirt so you can use that to tamp back in the post you put there. But then it's all mixed up with this broken up concrete, and it's difficult. And that's just on a small scale. Really makes me tip my hat to the crew that went from Mitchell Wesleyan to City Soleil in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake in 2012. We came just right after that team from Mitchell was there. And what we saw on the site, we saw this, this post structure with the rafters and the steel on top, but then all around the base of the post are these piles of rubble. And the missions team leader said, yeah, the team that was here before us from Mitchell, they had to move those piles around so we could set the posts where they needed to go. I'm like, wow, that was a lot of work. I'm glad we're coming after them, But way to go, guys. It's hard working around rubble. So again, the builders are just hitting the wall. And then the rumors from the wolf pack start spreading. Verse 11. Also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we'll be right there among them, and we'll kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they'll attack us. And so the threat of violence had returned, and the people are starting to freak out by this. Like, they're everywhere. At any time, they could kill us. So Nehemiah here, he's going to take some additional steps to praying and posting a guard. So let's finish the chapter out, and then we're going to highlight some principles. Verse 13. Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. So I love it. Nehemiah comes, and he comes to the Jewish builders, and he takes their eyes off of the wolves, and he sets their gaze on God, their great and awesome God. And on top of that, he asks them to think about their families and their homes, the things that are worth fighting for. Because there are things worth fighting for. Now, verse 15, when our enemies heard that we were aware of the plot and that God had frustrated it. That's interesting. I love it that Nehemiah isn't taking credit for it here. Yep, we outfoxed them. No. God had frustrated it. We all returned to the wall, each to our own work. But notice Nehemiah doesn't go lax after this. Verse 16, from that day on, half my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did the work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. Not only is that practical, not only does that promote their safety, it's also a morale booster. When you feel like you're under threat, but you got your sword right here, you could just grab it any time. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Nehemiah was very wise there. He knew the danger of false alarms. And he didn't want someone, different people in different places crying wolf all the time. He didn't want someone skittish. So the guy with the trumpet stayed with him. Verse 19. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. And he's reminding them, this is not a me mission, people. This is a we mission. This is us. And yeah, we're all spread out, but we don't have to guard everything at the same time. We each keep our eye on our own place, and when the trumpet sounds, we're there for each other. We are watching each other's back. And then Nehemiah also reminded them of the ultimate source of their hope. Our God will fight for us. Verse 21, so we continued the work with half the men holding spears from first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve as guard by night and workers by day. Now that seems like maybe they're doing double duty, but the truth is that allowed them to get more sleep. Because if you're out living on your own beyond the wall, isolated, you aren't going to sleep at night. You're going to have one eye open the whole time. But if you come within the city walls, you can share the load of keeping watch. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off their clothes. We're going to find out this was a 50-day project. So I'm like thinking, whoo. All right. Each of them had his weapon, even when he went for water. So here you see Nehemiah. He's paying the price too. But he's taking some really wise step in responding to these very real threats from Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, and the rest. First, he reminded them that ultimately their hope is in God. And he reminded them that there are things in life worth fighting for. There are battles where it's better to fight and lose than not fight at all. He also revised his plan. Okay, now don't miss that. Don't just breeze over that. Really think about that. Nehemiah, he was a man of great faith. All right, and so this isn't a sign at all of Nehemiah's faith weakening. Oh, we better adjust our plan. He had already seen God come through big time in so many ways that opened the door to this project happening. But he realized that there is a difference between my plans and my God-given mission. My plans are just my best thoughts on how to go about that mission. And we never give up on the mission. We fight for the mission, but we're flexible with our plans. So Nehemiah allowed these threats to cause him to work smarter, to live more wisely. Yeah, it probably slowed things down, but everything was hitting the wall anyway. The workers were getting tired. So when he puts half the guys on guard duty, not only does that help everyone feel more safe, that also gives guys a break from lifting rocks and putting them into place. So at the end of the day, here's what we should pull out of this. How do we deal with outright threats? We respond to threats with prayer, with practical action, with remembrance. Remember, God ultimately is our hope. And if necessary, a revision of the plan. Now, folks, you are all going to face opposition at some point. Don't forget this. This is still true today. These biblical principles still work. And notice that in both cases, Nehemiah's first response was prayer. It wasn't to complain. It wasn't to write a letter to the emperor of Persia. I find that interesting because they had a good relationship. It would have been so easy the moment he faced opposition. King, get these guys off my back. Instead, he pressed into God. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't try to spread counter rumors. He prayed. How do you respond when you're faced with opposition? Maybe some of you are feeling the heat of opposition right now. Is it bringing you to your knees first? Or are there some ways you really need to step up your prayer life? And you need to go to God first. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's at home. Maybe it's in your marriage. Where do you need to step up your prayer life? And then let the opposition you face cause you to work more wisely. The truth is that with mocking and with ridicule, even then there's usually this grain of truth to what they say. And sometimes that grain of truth is a test to us. And the test is, are we going to care more about being right, or are we going to care more about the truth? If we can take that grain of truth and learn something from it, we are responding with wisdom. And then make what adjustments that you need to make. That's how we deal with opposition. The next week, we're going to look at how Nehemiah deals with internal opposition, which is a different challenge, but it's real as well. You know that saying, we have seen the enemy and he is us. Sometimes we experience that even with our pursuing a God-given mission. And we find out others that we were counting on are pulling in a different direction. So don't miss that. And in the midst of that is this principle that's so key to you accomplishing your God-given mission, you aren't going to want to miss it. But don't tell me that this is boring. Someone who tells me this is boring hasn't read this. And don't tell me that this isn't relevant. This is gold. We just have to be willing to dig. And I pray that you are all digging into this personally. I'm so thankful God has given this to us. You pray with me? Father, the fact that you call us to these missions that really do put us in the center of this spiritual conflict going on, there's part of that scares me, and there's part of that excites me. And I'm guessing many here share that, God. I'm guessing most of us deep down would rather be on the front lines than in the sidelines. So God, I pray that you would just infuse us with this same courage and spiritual tenacity that Nehemiah shows. Lord, help us move forward with our eyes open. Help us not to get caught off guard the moment we hit opposition and we think that's something wrong or that you're in some way not coming through. No, this is reality, but you will help us through these things. And God, help us know the difference between our plans and your mission for us. And where there might be any ways that we do need to make the adjustment. Give us the humility to recognize that. God, help us remember the things that matter most and that there are things worth fighting for. Pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.